Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Ladi Akari-Dolwale. The headlines. Ukrainian official says air defenses shot down most Ukrainian drone attacks over Kiev this morning. Russian officials claim that 2 explosive devices were used on a key bridge in Melitopol. And the United States is said to be finalizing plans to send a Patriot missile defense system to Ukraine. We'll begin with news this morning out of the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, where explosions were heard in the center overnight. The mayor of Kiev, Vitaly Klitschko, says blasts rocked the central Shevchenitsky district and emergency services had been dispatched. The Kiev governor, Oleksiy Kuleba, says air defense systems are at work. Loud explosions were heard shortly after the air raid sirens sounded. Russia has repeatedly targeted Ukrainian energy infrastructure since October with missiles and drones. Mr. Klitschko later said the air defense had shot down 10 Iranian-made Shahed drones early on Wednesday. The city's military administration said a drone fragment had hit 2 administrative buildings in the city center. There are no details yet of any casualties. And the exiled mayor of Melitopol, Ivan Fedorov, has released a video showing a damaged bridge outside the Russian-held town in southeast Ukraine. In the short clip filmed at night, a vehicle is seen driving onto the bridge before approaching a section which appears damaged and then reversing away. The location of the video was verified by roads and scenery, which matched satellite imagery of the area. And Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba says Russia's huge missile attacks against Ukraine have turned the entire country into a front line. Mr. Kuleba says, quote, "It doesn't matter whether you're a soldier or a civilian, you're under attack, and that's how we feel." Speaking to foreign journalists from Kiev, Mr. Kuleba responded to a question about whether he places more value on weapons or energy supplies, saying both are almost equally important. Russia launched its barrage of missile attacks across Ukraine, targeting its energy infrastructure on October 10th and hasn't stopped since then. And Russia can't, quote, defeat the NATO bloc in Ukraine without using nuclear weapons. That's according to a Russian commander in the east of the country. Alexander Khodorkovsky of the Russian militia in Donetsk was speaking on state television and said that Moscow's resources were now limited. He also claims that Russia is now fighting the entire Western world, which is why the next escalation of the Ukraine war can only be one, nuclear. The Kremlin has not publicly responded to Mr. Khodorkovsky's comments. Last week, Russian President Vladimir Putin warned of the increasing threat of nuclear war, but said he viewed the Russian nuclear arsenal as a deterrent rather than a provocation. And some 70 countries and institutions worldwide have pledged more than 1 billion euros in immediate aid to help Ukraine get through a harsh winter as Russian forces batter its energy grid and other critical civilian infrastructure. France hosted a global meeting in Paris to discuss what could be offered between now and March to maintain water, food, energy, health, and transport during Ukraine's typically frigid winter. French Foreign Minister Catherine Colonna said over 1 billion euros had been pledged, with some 415 million devoted to Ukraine's energy sector, hammered by Russian airstrikes, adding that the participation of non-Western countries such as Qatar and Cambodia showed a widening of support for Ukraine.
Comme le président Zelensky a évoqué un chiffre.
As Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky mentioned a number, I wanted to tell you that the amount we raised altogether today reaches or even goes beyond the 800 million euros mentioned by President Zelensky. I'm happy to be able to announce to you we have moved closer to 1 billion euros. Our experts are still checking these announcements. Within this 1 billion, here are some main figures: 415 million for energy, 25 million for water, 38 million for food resources, 17 million for health, 22 million for transport, and 493 million more is not yet designated. The total slightly exceeds 1 billion. I'm talking about efforts worth 125 million euros in total from today until late March, the end of winter, which is France's contribution in this conference to urgently help the Ukrainian population to survive. By the way, with regards to our country, this is the most significant humanitarian effort that has ever been mobilized by France in such a short period.
During our warm encounters with our allies, our belief in the aggressor's inability to put Ukrainian citizens into the cold and darkness strengthens. They can't defeat the strength of our unity and determination. We highly appreciate this support from the civilized world, our friends and partners. Today at the conference, I had the opportunity to meet with representatives from different countries, organizations and financial institutions. For me, personally, and for all Ukraine, this is another powerful sign of the civilized world's support for Ukraine.
And the Biden administration is said to be finalizing plans to send a Patriot missile defense system to Ukraine that could be announced as soon as this week. And that's according to 2 U.S. officials and a senior administration official as well. However, the Pentagon's plan still needs to be approved by Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin before it is sent to President Joe Biden for his signature. Ukraine has been calling for the United States to send the advanced long-range air defense system that is highly effective at intercepting ballistic and cruise missiles as it comes under a barrage of Russian missile and drone attacks that have destroyed key infrastructure across the country. It will be the most effective long-range defense weapons system sent to the country, and officials say it will help secure airspace for NATO nations in Eastern Europe. And Russian Orthodox priests in Crimea, as you've just seen there, have conducted a ceremony to consecrate the Russian Navy ensign, the flag of St. Andrews for Russian Black Sea Fleet ships deployed in what Moscow has called its special military operation against Ukraine. The ceremony took place in the St. Vladimir Cathedral in Sevastopol. Among the ships whose flags received blessings were Russian Navy frigates, Admiral Essen and Admiral Makarov. Both vessels have been used to launch Caliber cruise missiles on Ukrainian targets.
It is difficult for me to define the category of the enemy we're fighting today with. Today we face threats known to all of us for a long time, but each inaudible, that any threat, any distortion which leads to the death of people, which leads to the suffering of people, originates from the devilish temptation and from the devilish destruction. In all the times, the cohort who turned to God received the help from God. Let us hope that our cohort who bent their heads and turned to God with a prayer and request to give them strength in this difficult time would never waver, that our truth would find its way to every human heart.
In another development, Indian and Chinese troops have clashed on their disputed Himalayan border, the first known incident between the two nuclear-armed Asian powers in nearly 2 years. In a statement, India's Ministry of Defense said soldiers from both sides sustained minor injuries in the face-off, which took place in the Tawang sector in India's northeastern territory of Arunachal Pradesh, a remote, inhospitable region that borders southern China. The 2,100-mile-long disputed border has long been the source of friction between New Delhi and Beijing, with tensions escalating sharply in June of 2020, when hand-to-hand fighting between the two sides resulted in the deaths of at least 20 Indian and 4 Chinese soldiers in Aksa Chin, Ladakh. Meanwhile, Taiwan's defense ministry says China has sent a record 18 nuclear-capable H-6 bomber aircraft into Taiwan's air defense zone as Beijing continues to step up pressure on the self-ruled island. The 18 bombers were part of 21 Chinese warplanes sent into Taiwan's Southeast Air Defense Identification Zone, a buffer of airspace commonly referred to as an ADIS, in the 24-hour span between Monday and Tuesday. The military said it monitored the situation and employed its fighter jets as well as land-based missile systems to track the Chinese planes. The flights represent the largest number of H-6 sorties in a 24-hour period since Taipei began releasing daily data on the Chinese fighter incursions in 2020. And former U.S. Marine pilot Daniel Dugan, who was arrested earlier this year in Australia, is accused of breaking U.S. arms control laws by training Chinese military pilots to land on aircraft carriers, and that's according to an indictment unsealed by a U.S. court. The 2017 indictment released by the District of Columbia Court said Mr. Dugan provided military training to the People's Republic of China pilots through a South African flight school on 3 occasions in 2010 and 2012. It lists unnamed co-conspirators, including 1 South African and 1 British national who were executives of a test flying academy based in South Africa with a presence in the PRC, and a Chinese national who acquired military information for the Chinese military. Britain announced a crackdown on its former military pilots working to train Chinese military flyers the same week Mr. Dugan was arrested in Australia. Australian police provisionally arrested him in the rural town of Orange at the request of the U.S. government in October, pending a likely extradition request by the United States. Let's talk now to former ambassador, Nigeria's former ambassador, that is, to Ukraine. He joins us from our Abuja studios, Frank Eso. Good morning to you, Your Excellency. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, good morning, Ladi. A pleasure to be here.
Let's start off with the main conflict incidents, shall we? This troubling one between India and China. Only yesterday I was discussing with one of my guests to say that India and China appear to be front and center of this conflict, but not on the battlefield. They are benefiting from cheap oil. But then all of a sudden this morning now we're hearing that the two of them are again at loggerheads on their disputed border. Are we letting some of these things slip through the cracks because all eyes are focused on Ukraine?
Well, it will appear so, but incidentally, these conflicts have been simmering at the surface for a very, very long time. You recall that about 2 years ago, there was this clash, between the two countries. And it's a reflection of the difficulty of reaching some kind of good neighborliness between the two countries. You recall in 1962, the brief war they had over territory in northern India. And that has soured relationship, between the two countries for decades. And during that period too, China and the then Soviet Union were having difficulties in their relationship. And if your enemy is fighting you, then that enemy can be turned to be my friend. So from that time onwards, the Soviet Union then strengthened relations with India and became the chief backer of Indian military. And that relationship, has been going on, and it's reflected in the support India is giving Russia since this Ukrainian war started. But then at the surface, the problem with China still continues. And I don't see how it's going to be resolved, because these are two nuclear powers fighting for supremacy, in the Indian subcontinent. So it's going to be really difficult, getting these two countries, to reach some agreement. And strangely enough, you'll think that since two of them support Russia in a way, buying cheap oil and all that, keeping the Russian treasury at the brim, you will think, that they'll have some relationship going between the two of them, but that is kept at a different level. It doesn't appear as if the kind of synergy they have, with respect to this Ukrainian war, will creep into their own relationship. So that's why, this problem is persistent between the two of them.
When last you appeared on the program, if I'm not mistaken, I remember raising the issue of Taiwan and China with you. And I remember on that occasion, you did say that is another long-standing, simmering conflict that seems to have bubbled to the surface because of what Russia is doing in Ukraine. Now, again, the statistics that we read this morning indicate that China is really ramping up pressure on the island by breaching its airspace repeatedly. It doesn't seem as if anybody is able to come to the aid of Taiwan, at least not immediately at this point. And China is making it clear that they do not intend to step back and allow Taiwan continue for any length of time as an independent territory.
Yes. You know, when you depend on a situation that allows you to claim ownership of a particular territory, it will be difficult for you to step back, particularly, you know, given the domestic policy, you know, in China. It's been agreed, you know, within the Chinese populace that Taiwan actually belongs to China, and they will never allow Taiwan to declare its independence from China. Now, what China is doing now, you know, is to assert that control over Taiwan. And this ramping up of probing of Taiwanese airspace only started about 6-7 months ago, when the United States allowed some top-ranking officials to visit Taiwan. And this has been a sore aspect of a relationship, you know, between the U.S. and China. So this ramping up of the probing of the airspace of Taiwan is to assure the Chinese people that they've not lost control over their desire to incorporate Taiwan, you know, within the Chinese mainland. And it's going to continue for a very long time. But I doubt, given what is happening in Ukraine, whether China will want to go the extra mile of physically attacking Taiwan. It might be very difficult for her because the results might not be too pleasant for her, the way things are now.
That brings me to the main battlefield that we have at the moment, which is in Ukraine. There are reports out of the United States that the U.S. is preparing to send to Ukraine its Patriot air defense missile interception system. Now, I've been trying to check the records since this information came out, and only one country has taken possession of this Patriot system, and that's Israel, outside of this conflict. The others, the United States deployed them in those countries, but it is being, the systems are being operated by U.S. troops in those countries. Now, there are no U.S. troops in Ukraine, so this necessarily means that if indeed it is true, the system is going to be handed over to the Ukrainians to operate. Do you think the Russians might view this as the kind of escalation they talked about earlier as a declaration of war and making the U.S. a co-combatant in the conflict?
Well, to start with, you know, I have my doubts if Russia really has any right to determine the country that should supply arms to Ukraine and the kind of arms, you know, that country should supply to Ukraine. You can't be devastating another country and tell other countries who are friendly, you know, with that country not to supply arms to that country to defend itself. Given what Russia is doing now, obviously war crimes, you know, destroying civilian infrastructure. You don't expect, you know, backers of Ukraine will just sit back and allow Russia to get away with it. And based on just what you said now, you know, not too long ago, the former Russian President Medvedev did allude to the fact that if the U.S. sends the Patriot missile to Ukraine, they will consider that, you know, a very, very unfriendly act. But this is what I consider saber rattling. I mean, Russia can't do anything about preventing the U.S., you know, from aiding her ally. Now, talking about operating that system, it takes quite a while. And I read somewhere that Ukrainian soldiers may be trained for a few months somewhere in Germany on how to operate these missiles. So what it means now is that even if approval is given now, it might still take a while, you know, for the missiles to be deployed in Ukraine until such a time, you know, that a reasonable number of Ukrainians have been trained on how to use them. Because I don't see the U.S., you know, getting involved physically by sending technicians to operate it for the Ukrainians.
Are you worried by because I know you described a lot of what is going on as saber rattling, but are you at all worried that a commander within the Russian military is openly calling for his country to use nuclear weapons, that because otherwise they cannot win this war. Are you worried at all? I mean, because I know I've spoken to you about this in the past, and you said, look, this is mutually assured destruction, and President Putin is nothing if not very pragmatic. So the idea of using nuclear weapons is not likely to be topmost on his mind. But if his own troops are now calling for him to authorize the usage, that takes it a bit higher, doesn't it?
Well, soldiers can say one thing, but the ultimate responsibility rests with the civilian leadership. And I want to assure you that even Putin himself cannot single-handedly take that decision to use nuclear weapons, because the implications are very, very diverse and grave, for Russia itself. Russia cannot be too sure of what the Western response is going to be. And I can tell you, maybe from guesswork, that there's going to be retaliation from the West if Russia ever tries to use that nuclear weapon. So that is the way I've always viewed it. So, I mean, Russia is conscious of this and will just have to continue fighting using conventional weapons. The war is not going well for her so far, and that's why she's been busy, destroying the civilian infrastructure, engaging what obviously, amounts to war crimes. But then, I don't see her, being that foolhardy to deploy nuclear weapons, because, it's a two-edged sword. Yeah, she can't say what is likely to be the retaliation, from the West. And don't forget, too, that Ukraine used to be the third largest nuclear weapon country until 1994, when it willingly transferred everything to Russia, in the course of negotiation, for full independence and all that. The technology is still there. You can't say what they can do in trying to start all over their nuclear program. So it's dangerous for Russia, because even if you drop it, they want to use tactical nuclear weapons that has limited range. You can't predict where the wind blows. It can blow back to Russia itself. So, its citizens, will probably be at risk. But I can assure you, I don't think the West, will just sit back and watch Russia use that terrible weapon.
I can't let you go, Ambassador Isso, without asking you this final question. And that has to do with the Ukraine humanitarian grain initiative. Now, you're someone who knows the dynamics of this very well. The Russians have better relations, obviously, with countries on the African continent. Russia is in several places fighting insurgency on behalf of some African countries. It has projects that it is executing in others, and all of that. Its relations have been fairly long-standing, inheriting most of those from the Soviet Union. But the Ukrainians are a different matter. But now they've launched this grain initiative. They are sourcing for funds from some of their donors and taking grains to African countries, the likes of Ethiopia, Sudan, and so on, as an act of goodwill. And it's obvious that what they want in return is support and some level of respect. Do you think they will get it, or is it a little bit too late?
Well, in the Nigerian political palace, we've heard of stomach infrastructure and what it does. So maybe let's say at the international level, this is another form of stomach infrastructure. Well, certainly somebody who feeds you, can be somebody you consider an enemy. Now, if you're not going to overnight start favoring that country in this conflict, but at least you might decide to play a neutral role in the conflict. That, to me, will be some success, for Ukraine. It's a gradual thing. It's just starting. And given hunger, in the land, I think somebody who supplies you food, is somebody you are more likely to associate with than somebody who is giving you gun to fight even when you are hungry. That's the way I look at the situation. So I see it as any form of diplomacy that might help to ingratiate Africa, to Ukraine in this conflict. And I read recently somewhere that arrangements have been made to see how such grains, can pass through Belarus, to Lithuania, and use Lithuanian ports, to start sending grains out, just in case they have difficulty in the Black Sea. So all that, will help towards winning friends.
Indeed.
It's going to happen that way, I believe so.
Indeed. Your Excellency, as always, a pleasure to have you on the program and to benefit from your wealth of experience. Thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure to be here.
Russian Invasion will be right back after this break, so please stay on with us. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. Russia's close ally, Belarus, has announced a snap military inspection, including increased combat readiness in the south of the country, the latest in a burst of exercises that have prompted concern from neighboring Ukraine. A flurry of Belarusian military action, including a counter-terrorism exercise last week, has kept Ukraine guessing about Minsk's intentions and raised concerns in Kiev that it might join the war on Russia's side. Russia and Belarus are formerly part of a union state and are closely allied economically and militarily. In a video statement published by the Belarus Defense Ministry, spokesperson Alexander Volfovich, State Secretary of the Security Council, said the checks would encompass practically all Belarus's operational commands. Belarus has said it will not enter the war in Ukraine, but President Alexander Lukashenko has allowed Russia to invade northern Ukraine from Belarusian territory, and in October ordered troops to deploy with Russian forces near the Ukrainian border. And U.S. Ambassador to the NATO bloc, Julian Smith, has admitted almost all NATO countries face depleted weapons and ammunition stockpiles due to the amount of armory they've sent to Ukraine. The U.S., NATO, and the EU are all working on urging the Western military industry to ramp up production to deal with the shortfall. Speaking at an event hosted by the CSIS think tank, Mr. Smith used the example of Estonia, which has given a massive quantity of aid to Ukraine and is now facing some very real shortfalls. While the contact group for Ukraine is focused on organizing deliveries to Kiev, NATO has tasked the Conference of National Armament Directors to deal with the problem of declining stockpiles across the alliance. Meanwhile, the EU has launched a separate initiative aimed at the military industry. Let's talk now to Andris Matusak, Deputy Head of the Foreign Desk at Pravda newspaper. As always, he joins us from the Slovakian capital of Bratislava. Good morning to you, Andris. Nice to see you again.
Good morning. Great to be having back.
Now, let me start with the last two stories that I've just read. The first, depleted military stockpiles. All the countries that have been supplying Ukraine an incredible amount of weaponry, which is why Ukraine is able to withstand the Russian attack, now depleted, having shortfalls in armory and weaponry. For someone like you, this doesn't come as a surprise, but the call on the defense industry to ramp up production, is that really possible and viable at this time, given the economic situation across the alliance?
Yes, of course, this is a big question, but I think there are some plans on the table. From what we know, the U.S. is going to ramp up the production of 155 millimeters artillery ammunition. They want to triple down it in the next 3 years. So there are some plans that countries might follow. And let's be honest, I think if there are money on the table, the defense industry will do the job. If there is a procurement, if there are deals that you have to produce something in a quick time, I think they can ramp up the production. But of course, as you said, those decisions might be also politically sensitive because yes, we are facing a lot of economic problems with inflation, with rising prices of the gas and oil and energy as such. So we will see if the leaders will try to find some balance on one hand to ramp up the production, and on the other hand also not to look like, okay, we are just giving money to the defense industry to make them rich. This is going to be a debate. But one thing I have to also add, if we are talking about depleted stocks, in some countries it is a little bit more complicated than to describe it like they don't have anything. For example, in US, you have a limit what you can give to the others and how much you still need to keep in the storages. For example, this is according to the legislation that they cannot give more from the storages than the legislation allows. So we will see, and there is a debate about this, that should we give Ukraine even more, because Ukraine is in a sense also protecting us from aggressive Russia, or should we still keep at least something for us in case of some direct confrontation with Russia or some other conflict. So I think we are going to see those debates. Some small country like Estonia was mentioned. I think they basically gave Ukraine like 40% of all their military equipment that they have, which is of course for such a small country a huge thing. So I think if NATO, EU, US will work together, I think it is these problems can be solved. But of course it needs some tough political decisions are required.
Are you worried that as it seems now that Belarus may be thinking of joining this conflict on the side of Russia, as the Ukrainians are beginning to suspect, given all the flurry of military activity that is suddenly happening on the southern border, which is with the northern part of Ukraine. And of course, as we have reported, Belarus and Russia are already closely allied formally before now. It's only that President Lukashenko had said he wouldn't put troops inside Ukraine. But it does look as if that might be changing. If Ukraine was faced with war on two fronts, the western and southern fronts, and then is faced with war on the northern front, do you think this might also change the climate of this conflict?
First of all, I think, and of course I might be wrong, because first, we don't have a crystal ball, and second, what we have seen with this war, we have seen a lot of surprises. But I would argue that there is still a very little chance that the Belarus will enter the war directly, that Lukashenko will send troops to Ukraine. All those maneuvers on the Ukraine-Belarus borders, I think, for now, are mostly aimed at to somehow scaring Ukrainians, to make them worry about, okay, there might be possibility, and maybe also to shift some troops to the Belarus borders. But I think that what must be said is that if I would be Vladimir Putin, I wouldn't think much of the Belarusian army, because the army is quite old Soviet. The army was trained, first of all, to suppress protest inside Belarus, basically to serve to Alexander Lukashenko as his own guard. You can say it wasn't properly trained being an expeditionary force. So basically being deployed somewhere. The Eurasian army was first of all trained to suppress the domestic problems, suppress the domestic protest. So I think that even if Belarus will decide, or even if Russia will push Belarus to send some troops to Ukraine, I doubt that they will make much of a difference. I think that facing now relatively well-equipped Ukrainian forces who are who have some skills from combat, I think that this might be a huge problem for the Belarusian army. I don't think they can do some difference in terms of that. Again, that the Ukraine would have to shift some troops there, but I really don't think this could be a game changer. The Belarus army is not up to this task to really fight Ukrainians. I simply don't believe that. Again, I might be wrong, but I don't think I am.
Now, let me come to where you are in Slovakia, and I want to ask about two things. The first is that I don't know whether that's true. You will tell me. We had talked about the fact that winter was coming, and at first the impression was created that it was a much milder winter than had been anticipated, which meant not as much energy was being used as had been anticipated, and that most of Europe had, adequate supplies. But in the last couple of days, it seems to have become colder all of a sudden, and we're hearing about -5, -10, in some places even -15 degrees Celsius. What is the situation like in Slovakia? How are people coping with the weather situation, especially from where we were coming? Slovakia is one of the countries that is supporting Ukraine. It doesn't have troops there, but it is supporting Ukraine in all the ways that all the other EU countries are. How are people surviving given the economic headwinds and now that coupled with the weather?
Yeah, I can say good morning from snowy Bratislava because it's like -3 and it's snowing. So you're right. But on the other hand, it's December. It's not something extremely unusual. Interestingly, also weather forecast. We have been following, for example, in October and November. I'm quite surprised that they were right because this forecast in end of October was like that. Before Christmas, which is right now, we can expect a cold wave, and it's happening. Before that, it was really mild weather, and we expect another mild wave of weather maybe after Christmas, or we will see. We are coping because, as you said, for example, gas storages are almost full. We are receiving gas also from the west. Don't forget that the dependency on Russian gas, the EU was able to really basically almost erase the dependency for many countries. Some countries are still quite dependent on gas, but from Russia. But for now, it seems it is not such a huge problem. The prices of energy rose up in a couple of weeks, but it seems it's now relatively stable. There is still a debate on the level of the EU if to introduce some limits on the price of energy or the price of electricity. And in fact, tomorrow there will be a EU summit in Brussels. I'm sure the leaders will be also talking about it. But I would say that so far so good. It's I cannot say for all the countries because I can imagine that if you're watching, I don't know, that the UK and quite cold, also Ireland quite cold. Maybe they are not that used to it. But in Central Europe, the winter means minus something. It means snow. People are somehow used to it, and also the Slovak government introduced some measures how to cope with the energy prices for people, for businesses. Not everybody is happy about it. For example, businesses would like to see even more help from the government, which might be coming, but is another issue here in Slovakia that we have a political crisis here, and the government will face a vote of confidence on Thursday. But it's probably not that important for your viewers. But so far so good. It's not perfect, but people are coping. Really, it's something which was expectable, and if so, there was a little bit, at least a bit of time to get ready for it. And again, the prices are now relatively stable. We will see, of course, if the winter will be very, very harsh for a couple of weeks, we might see some problems. But let's hope that the weather will be on Ukrainian side.
Indeed. One can only wish you the very best, Andred, my friend. Do stay safe out there. I know, as you said, the weather is expected, but this cold snaps arrive suddenly. As one who has had the privilege of being to some of these countries, I do know that they arrive suddenly, and if you're not prepared, you could get cut out. But thank you for your time on the program this morning. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Yeah, thank you very much. All the best.
And when we return, climate change effects, hotter, rainier, and wetter weather as climate change dramatically transforms the Arctic. Please stay on with us. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. And indeed, Ini John McQuarrie of our business desk joins me at this point. Morning, Ini.
Good morning.
$3.7 billion in losses. Total Energies is prepared to do that to be able to walk away from its investments in Russia.
Yes. So you remember yesterday we did talk about the extended law that all stakeholders, all investors from unfriendly countries, in submarine companies would not have any stake in it. So one of the second largest gas company in Russia is Novatek, and Total Energies has a major stake in it. So as you would expect, the law also affects them.
Right.
So before now, they were able to sell 49% of their stake in Novatek, but in spite of that, they still have a huge stake. But I mean, Total Energies is saying that they're now ready to just walk away and leave it for Russia.
For Novatek.
But what people are saying that Total Energies is just being on the surface sacrificial, but in real sense not, because Total Energy declared a profit of about 9 billion, in the fourth quarter of this year because of the hike in oil prices. You understand? So they're able to meet up or cover up
this seeming loss.
Exactly. So analysts are saying, well, they're just doing that because already, they've been able to make profit even from this situation.
The vaults are full, so they can afford.
Exactly, to look away, and it's too much trouble anyway because Russia is not ready to give in. Russia has its own laws and rules which it keeps adjusting to meet up or make it more difficult for any unfriendly company, to be able to access profits or dividends coming from Russia.
Indeed. Now, let me now bring you to the one that seemingly concerns us. Now, there are conversations ongoing. You and I were talking about them before the program started, about the US-Africa Summit.
Yes.
And naturally, big on that agenda is China, Russia
the war,
and Iran, this whole situation.
Yes.
What have we heard so far?
Well, we're hearing that Africa is in the middle of this great, they say when two elephants are fighting.
Africa is the grass.
Africa is the grass that is suffering now. And if Africa can just unite, then we'll have a stronger voice and be able to make our stand known, and then it will be for our benefits. Now, this is what they're saying, that the US is doing this, and it seems applaudable, but we know that countries don't just do things like that. The US may be trying to strengthen ties with Africa so that, we see China and Russia on the one side, on its own. We see Russia has its own summit. Remember
with Africa,
yes, they try to have their own summit.
And the Chinese too.
And the Chinese too. So one of the conversations going on at the summit is that this is just one way US is trying to close up its ties in the face of this war that is going on, to see if Africa will lean more towards the US. You know, because we're talking of sanctions and we're talking of finding alternative to Russian oil and gas.
Indeed.
And we do know that Africa, a lot of African countries, they do have this natural resources. The problem is getting them off the ground, developing them, and being able to export it to these other countries. So we hope Africa is not just the pawn.
I was waiting for that word, actually. Just
the word is all over. The word is just all over as Africa.
No, because, I mean, you've got the US-Africa Summit, which is the one we're talking about.
Yes.
You've got the French-Africa Summit. You've got the Russia-Africa Summit.
Yes, we
You've
have
got
the China.
Chinese-Africa Summit.
Exactly.
So, Africa seems to be in the middle of a lot of stuff.
Yes.
Is that to Africa's benefit, or is it to the benefit of the people organizing
I guess it just
the summit?
depends on Africa. If Africa would just get its acts together. I mean, we have ECOWAS. Have we been able to make the most of it? We have AFCFTA. Have we been able to make the most of it? The East Africa, the South Africa, as regions, have we been able to stand up, check the resources that we have, trade among ourselves, and develop our resources, and not wait for the Western world
I can see a lot of people nodding, you know, in their individual houses or offices as you say all those things. Points to ponder, Ini. But
Yes.
we'll keep an eye on that. Thanks
Sure.
for the update this morning. Ini and her crew will be on right after this on Business Morning, and then later on Business Incorporated. Let's take a quick look at some of the sports. We're just hearing now that the Ukrainian parliament has sanctioned 55 Russian athletes and 1 Ukrainian for showing support towards Russia's invasion of that country. There are some notable names on the list of Russian athletes sanctioned, including figure skater Kamila Valieva, who tested positive for trimetazidine during the Russian National Figure Skating Championships in December of 2021. Gymnast Ivan Kuliak, who has been banned for the sport for 1 year after wearing the pro-invasion of Ukraine Z symbol during an International Gymnastics Federation Apparatus World Cup in Doha, Qatar, in March, is also amongst the notable names on the list. The list includes 1 Ukrainian, though, football coach Anatoly Timoshuk, an assistant coach at Russian Premier League club Zenit St. Petersburg, and features athletes from 14 sports. A former captain of the Ukraine national team, Timoshuk is the nation's all-time most capped player with 144 caps. 8 wrestlers across 6 country, 8 wrestlers, 6 cross-country skiers, 5 boxers, 3 chess athletes, 2 footballers, as well as 7 athletes are all on that list. The sanctions are expected to last for 10 years. Brittany Griner's agent, Lindsay Kagawa-Collis, says the basketball star is, quote, heartbroken that Paul Whelan is still detained in Russia. According to her, she's thinking about his family and talked about her intention to call them as soon as she gets home. She's really committed to telling the story and making sure that this population of wrongfully detained Americans, that people know their names. Paul Whelan was arrested in Moscow in December of 2018 and sentenced to 16 years in prison for espionage. The Biden administration was unable to secure his release when they brought home Brittany Griner last week in a prisoner swap for convicted Russian arms dealer Victor Bout. And finally, on the program, each year, the Arctic region goes through an annual health checkup, and the results are in. From a rapid decline in snow cover to an unprecedented late-season melting event to another year of seabird die-offs, the Arctic has once again shown clear symptoms of an alien planet Earth. A report published by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration found that this vast and significant northern Earth zone is dramatically shifting, with snow cover declining at an alarming rate of about 20% per decade. It continues to warm 4 times faster than the rest of the Earth, with the last 7 years being the warmest on record, according to the report. Authored by more than 140 scientists around the globe, the Arctic Report Card examines the region's, quote, vital signs between October 2021 and September 2022, including changes in snow cover, sea ice volume, air and ocean temperatures, as well as a new pulse check on precipitation events. just goes to show that there's much more happening that could have much more lasting effects than the war in Ukraine or indeed any of the other conflicts that all eyes are currently on. That's our program this morning. My name is Ladia Kiridoluale. Thanks for being with us. There are updates throughout the day, but especially on the world today at 5 o'clock. Do watch out for that. But for now, do have yourselves a pleasant big week ahead. Good morning.